It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Steven Sabel.
I want to thank you, fellow Quillers, for joining us again for another episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. I'm so grateful to have you listening today, especially because this is a very exciting episode where we're going to welcome back one of our favored guests. Dr. Earl Showerman is here, and we're going to talk about the upcoming Shakespeare Authorship Symposium that will be presented by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship October 2 and 3 this coming year, very soon, in just a few weeks after you hear this broadcast, or hopefully within days of you hearing this broadcast. And it's going to be live and online. So we're excited to have you join us here on this program, and we hope that after hearing the contents of today's episode, you'll also be sure to tune in and join us for the symposium. Earl, welcome back.
Oh, thanks so much, Stephen. And I want our listeners to understand that the idea of holding this virtual symposium is Steven Sabel. Steven made this proposal to us back in June after we were so disappointed to have to cancel the Ashland Conference due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the closure of the Shakespeare Festival theaters. So your host is actually the provocateur that made this all possible. My role as the program chair of the conference committee was to help recruit good speakers. And believe me, Stephen, I think we've really got a great lineup. There'll be a number of speakers speaking live during the symposium from Napa, California. And our host, Ben August, has graciously offered his estate as a place where we could actually set up a studio and do the recording. And we have a number of scholars from around the country who are going to be sending in pre-recorded content to be integrated with the live stream presentations. So I think we have a terrific program lined up, including a new voice that most Oxfordians have not had an opportunity to hear yet, and that is Donald Ostrowski, who's a faculty of the Harvard Extension School and who's just recently published a book, Who Wrote That?
Who Wrote That? And it's an incredible book because it doesn't just touch on the Shakespeare authorship question. It touches on a lot of other authorship questions that have existed throughout the ages. And it's wonderful that Dr. Ostrowski would include such an in-depth chapter in his book about this particular mystery that we're all so absorbed in. But if you read his book, you may find there's a few other mysteries that you suddenly get absorbed in, and you start trying to really discover the true authors of the true writings of a lot of things.
Oh, your readers are going to love this. I mean, he talks about the origin of the Pentateuch, the first books of the Old Testament, whether Moses was responsible for that text. And then, of course, he goes all the way to the Far East and looks at Confucius and his Analects and the Abelard and Heloise letters. And so we have a whole variety of things, but his primary interest in Shakespeare and the authorship question goes back quite a few years. And he compares the question of whether Shakespeare wrote the works of Shakespeare to that of Andrei Kurbsky, a prince and military leader, and Tsar Alexander Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible. There was a correspondence there, and he compares the historical analyses of these two questions in comparison during his presentation. So I look forward very much to learning more about that.
That's going to be one of the headliners of the symposium coming up, and we're very excited to have Dr. Ostrowski as part of the lineup. But in addition to him, we do have this all-star cast of Oxfordians, some of our favored researchers and top lecturers and presenters that we've seen at our conferences over the years. And, you mentioned, and I sat here and blushed as you gave me credit for the symposium happening, but that's not true. I mean, it's easy to have an idea, but it takes a great organization like ours to make that idea come to fruition as successfully as we have. And a big part of that has been these presenters who have stepped up, who are going to be joining us in Napa, or who have gone to their own studios or found a studio space to record their pre-recorded presentations to include in the programming. And it's an exciting schedule of about 10 hours of enriched programming. Let's talk a little bit about some of who they are and what they're going to be presenting so that our listeners get a bit of a preview and they'll be sure to register and tune in.
Well, I think one of the great thing about this is that the Oxfordian researchers and writers in the Bay Area are the ones that are primarily going to be presenting at the conference live with you, Steven. So I think we want to really tip our hat to Marc-Andre Alexander, who some of you may remember from the video contest last year, and when he was talking about Oxford and Hamlet, and he kept on saying and they say it's only a coincidence as he falls apart. So Mark's actually a terrific speaker and an expert in Shakespeare in the law, but he's going to be talking about Shakespeare Stratfordian blind spots in terms of how closed-minded Stratfordians are to evidence that's been being presented actually for the last century. So something about the psychology of that. But I want your listeners to understand that Mark also has a website called sourcetext.com, I believe it is. And if you Google just source text or Shakespeare source book, you will find his website, which has a phenomenal amount of material of virtual accessible PDFs, everything from the first through the fourth folios. The full text of those folios are available. PDFs of over 30 Shakespeare quartos. PDFs of Shakespeare Identified and J. Thomas Loney's The Poems of Edward de Vere, The Star of England by the Ogburns, Robert Bazill's research, various Oxfordian videos, texts of the dedications to the Earl of Oxford. There's, I think, 25 that he's found and listed there. And then the commentaries by George Putnam, Francis Mears, Peacham, and Chapman and others that are reference the Earl of Oxford. Plus, he has the text of apocryphal plays, the number of works of John Lilly, Thomas Watson, Robert Greene, and Webb are listed there. So it's a phenomenal source for finding textual support for the research that people are interested in doing who are fascinated by this problem. So it's an underserved, underused resource, and I want to be sure to...
Do we have links to that on our website, on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website? I hope we do. And if not, we need to make sure that we do.
we definitely should, because in Mark's article on Lord Burleigh and Polonius in Hamlet, it's quite remarkable. It's I sent it to Thomas Cecil, who's, Michael Cecil, the descendant of Thomas Cecil.
The current Lord Burleigh?
Well, he's past Lord Burleigh. He's passed on that title to other family members right now. But I sent him that article, and he was quite fascinated by it. I was very impressed that Mark Alexander's research was so good.
But to quote Mark Alexander, it's only a coincidence.
Yes, thank you very much. So I think you should all look forward very much to Mark's commentaries on Stratfordian blind spots. And of course, our favorite, scholar from the Bay Area, I'm sorry, Ramon and John, but Catherine Chilgen, an all-star presenter, and her wonderful book, Shakespeare Suppressed, and you and Catherine had a wonderful conversation on the podcast a few months ago.
We did.
I think that she always brings new material and exciting material, and she's going to be speaking on the origins of Shakespeare's Prospero in The Tempest. The title of her talk is Lord Prospero in The Tempest and Lord Prospero Visconti. And she's talking about the research by Ernest Gombrich, who was an art historian, another independent scholar of a different origin, who identified this Viscount as whose life story matches that of Shakespeare's Prospero, so that there are historical characters that match the names that Shakespeare chose in creating The Tempest. So,
was he a Viscount of a place like Milan?
Yes, of Milan.
Oh, of Milan.
Yes.
Oh, my word.
I know. And, Catherine mentions that Gombrich presented this material to another scholar who was working on an edition of The Tempest, and it was totally ignored. It was too subversive to think that there might actually have been a historical Italian character that matched the life story that Prospero relates and tells.
Well, yeah, because then that opens the door to how the heck could the author have known this? How could he have had any exposure to this true historical Italian Viscount? And where the heck does he get these references from Stratford?
It's another part of that Italian connection that's so enriched for Oxfordians. I mean, Richard Rowe's books and research that Kevin Gilveri has done on this question is very interesting also. But Catherine's joining the fray in there and pointing out all these direct topical Italian connections within the play that tends to underline the theory that whoever wrote those plays had to have spent some time in Italy and be familiar with Italian literature and the Italian language.
If there is a draft somewhere, a lost manuscript somewhere, a lost few pages of one of the Shakespearean plays, my guess is it's somewhere in Italy, blocked away in some estate somewhere or in somebody's trunk or attic that the Earl of Oxford left behind inordinately or by mistake, and it exists, and that's going to eventually be the smoking gun. Italy holds the key. I'm certain of it.
Well, Professor Michael Delahoyde of Washington State University and his research colleague Colleen Moriarty have spent 4 summers in Italy looking for this very text.
There is a podcast episode about that very topic with
Yes.
Michael Delahoyde. So if you haven't listened to that one, make sure you go and find the list of episodes. There's the great Catherine Children episode that you just mentioned. There's the Michael Delahoyde episode as well.
Right.
So we want our listeners to be sure to go back through the catalog. If you haven't heard them all, you need to.
I have to just relate as an aside that very recently, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship acquired the personal papers of Richard Paul Rowe, the author of the Shakespeare Guide to Italy. And these papers have been delivered to Michael Delahoyde, and he is very excited to be reviewing the primary materials of a man who spent 20 years going to Italy and exploring the topical allusions and geographical and literary connections between Shakespeare and the Italian lands. So very exciting stuff. So.
There's two heavy hitters right there between Marc-Andre Alexander, who also, by the way, and as we talked about, his video entry from last year was one of the finalists in the contest.
Yes, it was. And I propose, Stephen, right here now that our listeners and the viewers get to see that as a prelude to his talk.
We recently posted it on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Facebook page to promote voting for this year's video contest. And if you haven't gone and watched this year's finalist and placed your vote, you need to do that before you run out of time. And part of the online symposium lineup will also include announcing this year's winners.
Excellent. And this group of videos is quite phenomenal. I enjoyed all of them very much.
It's a really outstanding collection, and it's going to be a real tough decision. And I'm glad that the viewers are voting and deciding, and not the judging panel, on who the top prize winner will be.
Be sure to cast your votes, friends. And if you have more than one email address, don't vote twice. That's forbidden these days. Okay.
Wait a minute. Vote early and often. That's what I was.
All right. No, so a third speaker who's going to be live from Napa is Ramon Jimenez, co-recipient of the Oxfordian of the Year in 2019 for his prodigious work on a variety of subjects. His most recent book, Shakespeare's Apprenticeship, which is an outstanding look at the apocryphal plays, identifying the real playwright's earliest works. But we have asked him to speak on a topic that he has developed from previous presentations on the 10 eyewitnesses who saw nothing. These are people who had direct relationships with Will Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, who never commented on him as a writer. And he outlines and describes each of these various characters, and I'll just mention a few names here. One of them is being William Camden, who was involved in the award of the coat of arms, and who wrote a fabulous book called Britannia, which was published in repeat editions. And in the chapter on Warwickshire and Stratford-upon-Avon, he mentions the mayor of Stratford and somebody who became an archbishop, but he never mentions Shakespeare's name, even though he was well aware of the place during that time. Michael Drayton, another famous poet from Warwickshire, never mentions Shakespeare. John Hall, the Earl of Oxford's physician son-in-law, makes no mention of...
No, you mean Shakespeare's.
Shakespeare, sure.
Shakespeare's son-in-law.
Sure. And then, of course, Fulk Greville, and then he also mentions Edward Alleyn, and most relevantly, Philip Henslowe, whose diary included the names of 280 plays, almost all of which we are no longer extant. Only 40 of those 280 are known to have a textual reality today. Dozens of accounts of actors' names, 27 different playwrights mentioned, but not one mention of Shakespeare. Not one in Henslow's diary. Even though over a decade of research.
But wait a minute. I've seen Shakespeare in Love, and Henslow is a major character. Tom Stoppard made all that up? Oh, man.
They made up a lot of stuff in Shakespeare in Love, but you really ought to read the Shakespeare in a Divided America by James Shapiro, because this final chapter is all about the evolution of the script for Shakespeare in Love and Tom Stoppard's work on it, and how problematic it was to find a practical solution to the question of infidelity and homoeroticism that's implied in the action and in the text of the play itself, of the screenplay, itself. So it's a fascinating approach to that. I was unaware of all the things that went into it. Of course, an Academy Award, and wonderful, very entertaining film. And the dramatic production they did at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival a few years ago was absolutely
I have a copy of the script for the stage play, and it's quite well done, and it's really good adaptation of the film, but the production aspects are very difficult with the number of settings and the large cast, and it's an expensive play to produce.
Yeah.
Well, so who else do we have on the lineup for October 2 and 3?
Well, you, of course, will be also speaking on the Mentors of Genius.
Yes, that's correct. I have a presentation I think is very compelling, and it compares the lives of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Albert Einstein, and Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. And what I have discovered in my research, and what I'll be pointing out in my presentation, is that all three of those men were considered to be geniuses of their time. Even Oxford, if you don't credit him with the Shakespearean plays, was a genius of his time. And there's plenty of reference to his excelling at so many different things during his lifetime. And the one thing that the three men absolutely share is that during their lifetime, there were other men in their lives who recognized that genius and fostered it. And that's how we received the work we received from these three men. So it's a fun presentation, makes a great comparison, and you'll learn a lot about who helped Mozart become Mozart, who helped Einstein become Einstein, and who helped Edward de Vere write the works of Shakespeare.
I'm so looking forward to that, Stephen.
Thank you.
I'm excited that that it's a different approach, and I think all of us need to be aware of the way we all can think of this. The mosaic of questions and how this all came to be this wonderful literature. Well, along that line, Cheryl Egan Donovan has submitted a video that we're going to be playing during the program. And of course, Cheryl was the Oxfordian of the Year last year for her wonderful documentary film, Nothing is Truer Than Truth, which again focuses on Shakespeare's experience in Italy and the Italian connection. And she'll be talking on Shakespeare Author, creating authentic characters for the screen. And what she's doing is she's looking at contemporary 20th century and 21st century filmmaking and the successful filmmakers, and comparing them to Shakespeare's use of the technique of infusing his work with his own life experience. The exact kind of thing that new criticism or the new historicism would point you away from, that the authors put themselves in the play, their emotional, their experiences, something of their personal histories enters into the art. And of course, she uses filmmakers like Godard, Truffaut, Kurosawa, and Fellini for examples. In American film, Gus Van Sant, Greta Gerwig, Spike Lee, among others, are mentioned also in her presentation. So she talks about the narrative creation of memorable characters that reflect one's personal life experience, the creative director, writer's personal experience.
Yeah, and there are, again, going back to the list of podcast episodes that are available, we have an episode where Cheryl talks all about the making of her film. And then just recently we did an episode on this topic, Shakespeare Author. And I'm so glad to see that she's doing a formal presentation about it, because if that podcast episode didn't whet your appetite to this, I don't know what else would. In fact, I told her during the podcast episodes we were discussing, I said, I just want to, because she teaches this to her students.
Yes.
In the university. And I said, can I just come and audit one of your classes? I just want to come and sit in on this class and be a student in this class. So I'm so glad we're going to get at least a taste of that through her presentation. That's going to be very exciting.
Very exciting. I'll have to tell you one thing that will make you envy me a little bit, Stephen. I actually got to go to Lesley University and speak at one of Cheryl's classes on my research on Midsummer Night's Dream. So I have been in her classroom, and their students are very, very engaged, very active. And Lesley University is one of those universities in Cambridge that actually has several faculty members that are very committed to the Oxfordian cause. So Cheryl being among them. So that's just wonderful that she's doing this and has created this video for us to appreciate. And she's working on a book of the same title. So look forward so much to her ongoing engagement with this. Cheryl's engagement with this goes back 15 years that I've known her in the development of her film projects and other research on this. So she's very, very well experienced and has come to every one of our conferences over these years.
And as a filmmaker, she loves her craft. She loves the craft of filmmaking, and she also has such a strong affinity for some of those filmmakers that you mentioned that she has studied and that she's going to be bringing up in her presentation and forming those comparisons. So it's going to be a very, very interesting presentation.
Well, one of Cheryl's most fascinating subjects is Shakespeare's poetry, of course. And Sky Gilbert has recorded a presentation on his very new, very recently published book, Shakespeare Beyond Science, When Poetry Was the World. Sky Gilbert is a professor at Guelph University in Toronto and a noted playwright and performer at a variety of venues. But this book is really looking at Shakespeare's use of an elaborate language as being just as important and foundational to his success in characterizing and developing narratives, that it's his use of an elaborate rhetorical system that is enriches the work so much and distinguishes it from other writers of that time, that unlike Sidney and Spenser that would write more straightforward prose, he was more interested in a far more elaborate, rhetorically enriched euphuistic style that you find in the works of John Lyly. And in some of Shakespeare's plays, Love's Labour's Lost certainly used euphuistic stylings. And, when you look at the rhetorical devices that Shakespeare used in his plays, it's just phenomenal. I took a Shakespeare class 15 years ago from a wonderful teacher at Southern Oregon University, and he handed us a list of rhetorical devices in Shakespeare, and it's just phenomenal. There was about 40 different Greek and Latin terms that described various elements of the rhetorical systems that Shakespeare employed in his writing. And so it's deeply enriched language, and Sky is focusing on that in his book. He's looking at the influence of Sturm, Johannes Sturm, a German scholar, and most renowned German scholar of his time, that Earl of Oxford actually spent time visiting on his way to Italy. He talks about Hermogenes, who's a Greek rhetorician that noted innumerable styles that could be used, and he feels that Shakespeare Oxford was inspired by Hermogenes' examples in using a variety of styles. And we do know, of course, that even within one play, he'll vary the style of speech considerably. Like in Midsummer Night's Dream, the rude mechanicals speak in prose, whereas, the Lysander and Helena and Hermia and Demetrius speak in rhyme couplets. I mean, so it's status-based rhetorical, representations of speech that are so well integrated and so help define the nature of the characters. So Sky is focusing on those kinds of considerations in Shakespeare, and he says that there's a magical connection between style and content that Shakespeare understood and manifested in his writings of the poetry and in the plays, that's foundational and overlooked by a lot of scholars in terms of the richness of the text.
And just yet another presentation that I'm so looking forward to, that was foreshadowed through an episode of this podcast series, because Sky joined us about a month or so ago to discuss his new book and that it was coming. And now it's here, and now we're going to get to enjoy his presentation that sort of highlights the book. So those of you who remember that episode, I mean, for all of our listeners, this is like a cornucopia of the best of Don't Quill the Messenger, but it's going to be both live and recorded presentations that are video presentations that are also going to have backup material and PowerPoint presentations along with them. It's going to be a very exciting program that we have shaping up.
Well, your listeners should all register for the program. Go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website, click on the conferences, and then register for the symposium. And what you'll receive from that registration is a copy of the schedule of talks and a full syllabus, which is at this point over 10 pages of descriptions of the presentations, the little bios on each of the presenters, and a reading list. So be sure to register for the symposium, by going to the SOF website and click on the conference, and then just click on symposium registration, and you will automatically start receiving electronic materials that will support the symposium.
And it's absolutely free. It is absolutely free to register. It costs you nothing. And we're not trying to rope you in by you register and we're suddenly going to start marketing stuff to you. No, we only need that registration information so that we can send you this backup information that you're going to need that's going to help enrich your experience in enjoying the symposium. So don't feel leery about, giving us your email and all that. That's going to help us provide you this extra material that you'll be able to have and use while you're viewing the symposium. So it's absolutely free to register and it's free to watch the symposium. Every bit of it is at absolutely no cost to the viewer. You don't have to register in order to tune in live to our YouTube channel during the presentations. But if you do register, it's going to provide you all this extra material that's going to help enrich your viewing and enrich your experience.
Well, and Stephen, I want your listeners to know that the production of the symposium has been supported by donations in the name of Thomas Renier, in the memory of Tom Renier. And we will have some presentations regarding his life and his contribution to the Oxfordian cause during the symposium. But when people were rebated the conference registration fees and ticket purchase fees that they had made, they were given an option of contributing part of that or all of it in the memory of Tom Renier. Stephen, we received so many donations in the name of Tom Renier that the entire cost of the symposium has been covered by the generosity of Oxfordians who had planned on coming to the conference, not knowing that their contributions actually might create a whole new program. And so I would encourage any of you that are listening that are moved to support these kinds of programs to consider donating when you go to the SOF website.
And as part of the spark for this symposium to occur, that makes me feel really good. It makes me feel tremendous to know that there were that many people who wanted to see us do something, to move forward with something, to be able to make it work, and to do it in Tom's memory and for Tom. And that is a part of what the symposium broadcast will be as well, is we will have a memorial portion to Tom to recognize him and honor him for his contribution that continues even after his life.
Absolutely. And the other featured speaker this year is James Warren. Jim Warren has dedicated the last years of his life entirely to the Oxfordian cause. His index of Oxfordian articles is an amazing resource, which I turn to all the time. It's over 750 pages of an index of Oxfordian articles and books that have been published over the years. So he is a prodigious researcher, and in recent years has been particularly interested in the life of J. Thomas Looney. He is the editor of the recently published Shakespeare Identified, a re-release of the Centennial Edition that's available. I taught a class at the Lifelong Learning Program this last winter in Ashland, and about 25 people attended that class, and they all bought Jim Warren's Centennial Edition, which is available on Amazon for a very reasonable price. And the other book we read during that course was, of course, Catherine Children's Shakespeare Suppressed. So that makes a very clever title of a class, Shakespeare Identified and Shakespeare Suppressed. So I do think that you very much will enjoy Jim's presentation, which he's pre-recorded. and provided for us, which has to do with really the difficulties of J. Thomas Looney's convincing scholars to take seriously his work. He said his comment is that it would have been much easier if there was no known author to convince people that Edward de Vere is the true author of the Shakespeare canon than to have an existing persona who's really a myth in place to demythologize the existing attribution is a far greater challenge than it would have been had there not been a whole theory based on the Stratford commoner.
And so many great Shakespeare authorship doubters throughout history have mentioned that and have said the same. From Mark Twain to Ralph Waldo Emerson. There have been those who have talked about how people just refuse to let go of that bardolatry that has been instilled in them through the ages of presupposes and mythological stories, all the way to he was poaching deer on somebody's land and all the other stuff that we hear about Shakespeare of Stratford that there is absolutely no evidence for whatsoever. And when they are confronted with the very little bit of evidence that we truly have of that man's life, and then the overwhelming amount of evidence that we have of Edward de Vere's life, it still is difficult for them to let go of that godlike persona of Shakespeare of England.
Yes. He was the Brit of the millennium, according to the polls that were run in England in the year 2000. So, he surpassed Winston Churchill, Queen Elizabeth the First, among others. And Isaac Newton. Shakespeare, numero uno.
Yeah.
So that and in reflection of that situation and those ideas, we also have Brian Wildenthal speaking in a pre-recorded messaging about his ongoing research on the early authorship doubts, the Oxfordian connections is what he's going to be talking about. And this is an expansion on work that he's done in his book, Early Shakespeare Authorship Doubts, which was published a few years ago. Brian is the editor of the SOF website, the content editor, and been an Oxfordian for a number of years and very, very engaged and involved in our programs. But he's pointing out how early on, contemporaneous with Shakespeare and Oxford and the writing of the plays, there were writers writing material that would be highly suggestive of the fact that the attribution of the works is up for grabs, and that a nobleman of Oxford's description may very well have been recognized by a small group of writers at that time to have been the author of the actual canon itself, but because of a variety of political reasons that these could not be openly attributed to a ranking earl of the realm.
That research and some of that research in some of those areas have also been embraced by some of our other scholars in the past. And I think that it's those types of allusions, it's those types of references from the actual time period where we truly have the opportunity to answer the biggest question that I tend to receive from those who learn about the Oxfordian theory and then want to know more. And one of the things that makes it so difficult for them to give up the mythology of the Stratford man is, well, this sounds like a big conspiracy theory. You're all a bunch of conspiracy theorists, and this sounds like a big conspiracy theory. You're telling me nobody knew? How could nobody know? Why would they all keep it a secret? And what these allusions prove is that there were quite a number of people who knew. In fact, many of them even mention it in different places here and there. It was the big known secret that just couldn't be openly discussed. And I think that kind of research and what Brian's presentation proves a lot of that.
I absolutely. And, there are other writers, really in the classical era whose identity were not known until centuries after their death. The famous Roman satirist Juvenal, who wrote wonderful satires, and they're all political, of course. And he had to write them anonymously. This is during the Roman emperors, would have banished anybody. Of course, Augustus banished Ovid, to Romania, basically, for things he wrote and said. But Juvenal was not discovered until 250 years after his death. So there is a tradition, and I know Shakespeare was familiar with Juvenal's satire. So He certainly references them, and President John Adams actually noted that juvenile satire is mentioned in 10th satire is mentioned in Hamlet's description of what happens to old men in his mocking commentaries to Polonius. So the tradition of hiding the authorship of these subversive or satiric works, very important for the author's survival. The first rule of writing is the writer must survive. The other rule is interpret resistance.
And so who else do we have?
Well, besides Jim Warren and Brian, I am going to be giving a presentation. Actually, it's already been recorded on Shakespeare and politics. And I will be talking a little bit about representation of Shakespeare in the 21st and 20th centuries for political messaging. And the first play that came to my mind about this was the production of The Tragedy of Julius Caesar by the public in the Delacorte Theater in New York in 2017 during the summer after Donald Trump was elected president, in which a Donald Trump caricature was portrayed as Caesar, and it was done in a modern scene. It caused quite an uproar and the withdrawal of corporate sponsors for this, and the media really got worked up about it. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. That's well described, actually, in James Shapiro's book, Shakespeare in a Divided America, which I do recommend.
Did he like it? Because I remember when that happened and when that production came out, and I know the critics hated it. It's not that they disagreed with the messaging, because a lot of the critics were in a very left-leaning media setting where, we'd love to see Donald Trump stabbed to death on stage, but they hated the production. The production apparently wasn't very good.
Well, the commentaries on it, I think, are worth reading, and particularly Shapiro's description of, because he was actually working with the Public for a number of years. Now, the Public is a very successful theater company. It's been going for 50 years, and they've won a number. Over 40 Tony Awards. They brought out Hair, Hamilton, the Chorus Line. So they've always put cutting edge theater out there. And this is a modern dressed President Caesar. So they use that. And they even talk about the fact that he could get away with stabbing your mother on Fifth Avenue and you'd still vote for him. You would still support him. So they introduce commentaries that derive actually from statements politicians have made in recent years. The New York Times actually gave it a reasonably favorable review, but it overemphasized the violence of civil war in this, and it's not in the text. I mean, they had the conspirators mowed down, as like assassinations and explosions going on stage. So there was modern warfare, so it increased the violence. Now, what happened is that there was a 12-second video of the assassination, actually, and apparently the Trump character fought back, or the Caesar character fought back like a boar, is the description. And so it was a particularly violent assassination, the stabbings. And at one point near the end of the production run, a woman ran up on stage who is now a candidate for Congress in Florida, and live stream her protesting the killing of President Trump on the stage. And a couple days later, she appeared on the Sean Hannity show saying how she'd saved Caesar's life, Trump's life, on the stage at Central Park. And the media went nuts over this one. But I think you might be right that the style in which the play was conceived overstated in some regards the political point that Oscar Eustace, their artistic director, made, and they were not at all prepared for the blowback that they got.
Well, it's a giant stretch is why. The comparisons between the two are so minimal. And I get the political message the artistic staff was trying to create out of it, but it's, in my opinion, in that play, it's not there.
Yeah.
And the messages in that play are actually completely opposite in many, many ways.
Absolutely. It's not intended to endorse assassination.
No.
It's to show that the chaos in the Civil War that follows it is immensely more destructive.
The power vacuum is far more destructive to the citizenry. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and it would not surprise readers that President Obama was once portrayed in a production as a Julius Caesar, in a production that was from 2012, so it was during his presidency, by the Guthrie Theater, directed by Rob Melrose, who was a disciple of Oscar Eustace. I've seen images of this. In one of the opening scenes, they show the Caesar character, who's a tall, black man holding a basketball. And I thought, well, this must be Henry V. And they have substituted tennis balls for basketball. Well, no, it was a production of Julius Caesar, the tragedy of Julius Caesar. And, there was no outcry on that. And it toured the country. It performed for a couple months in New York after its run in Minneapolis. So I think there are people reacted differently to a similar theme production in which a current political leader was portrayed as a Shakespearean character.
In Southern Oregon, in Ashland, the last production of Julius Caesar that they produced, they cast Caesar as a woman. And then the audience watched a woman get assassinated. And there, of course, was a lot of discussion about that as well, because does that change the theme? Does that change the story? Do audiences respond differently to violence against a man than they do to violence against a woman? That opened up all those doors as well. And that didn't quite go over as well as it could have either for them, I don't think.
I know, I saw that production and I agree with you, but the most compelling politicized view of Julius Caesar I ever saw was a 1982 production of on the Oregon Shakespeare Festival stage, directed by Jerry Turner, which was done as a Latin coup. And this was less than a decade after the coup in Chile, in which 4,000 leftists were executed. 40,000 people were placed under long-time arrest at the National, Stadium. Hundreds of thousands of people went into exile from Chile because of the junta. But it was portrayed very much like that kind of style. And right after the assassination, the 6 doors of the theater opened and actors wearing military outfits and automatic weapons stepped in. And suddenly you were an innocent caught in a stadium. It was a bone-chilling, I still feel the chill right now, moment. And then they disappeared. The lights came up and we all went down and had our coffee and brews. I mean, you
needed a beer for intermission after that.
You needed something to drink. My brother-in-law, who was a colonel in the Air Force at the time, was so disturbed by that he was speechless for the next day. And then he came and told me it was the greatest production of Shakespeare he ever saw, that it struck his heart so deeply, the moment of terror, that it had a profound effect upon his thinking about that play and about Shakespeare and the brilliance of the production.
Well, and see, and that is far more in line with what I believe the message of the play was meant to deliver. You know, if you think about this, Shakespeare's a nationalist.
Right.
And what he is warning about is if you take out a sovereign, meaning the queen, because there were a lot of assassination conspiracy plots against the queen, including the Pope himself at the time saying, if you kill her, I'll absolve you.
Yes.
It won't be a sin. So, the true message of the play is don't kill the queen, don't kill the sovereign, and how fickle and how dangerous the crowd can be.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the best scenes in the play to convey that kind of messaging is the tearing of Cinna the poet, which is the scene where the crowd says, oh, it's him. He's Cinna. And he says, I'm not Cinna the senator. I'm Cinna the poet. I'm Cinna the poet. We don't care. Your name is Cinna. And they literally tear him to shreds on the stage. And it shows that mob mentality of, well, we don't care if you're actually guilty. We don't care what side you're on. You're not with us. We're the mob. You're going to die. And ironically, you see some of that happening right now in some major cities in this country. And so there, Shakespeare prophetic about what happens when there's a power vacuum and the mob is in control. And that, I think, is more clearly the message of the play.
Yes.
As opposed to, you should kill this terrible leader.
Well, we're talking about the politicizing of Shakespeare for the purposes that may be either left-wing or, in fact, even fascist, because World War II era, there was a production of Henry V that Winston Churchill asked Laurence Olivier to produce, which was, I comment on in my presentation. At the same time, the German intellectuals and Hitler himself were fascinated by Shakespeare. Hitler is known in Goebbels' diary to have said, why is it that, I've read Goethe and Schiller and the German poets, none of them match Shakespeare. He says, they give us Nathan the Wise, who negotiates successfully between the Hebrews and the Christians and the Muslims, while Shakespeare gives us Shylock and the Merchant of Venice. They were very fascinated by Hamlet and also Julius Caesar, the Italian fascists and even the Japanese fascists had a strong feeling for Shakespeare. So I received this kind of information from a recent podcast guest you've had, Professor Wally Hurst, Professor Emeritus.
I was about to mention that.
Yeah, and so I do include some of Wally's slides in my presentation, and then I jump back to do a time travel back to the 16th century and talk about the censorship and the fate of poets and playwrights who don't write what the Queen likes, what the Star Chamber wants.
You want to talk about fascism and totalitarianism?
Yes.
Yeah, we have no clue what that is like in today's modern age.
And we only have a fraction of the plays from that era, but there were obviously satires being written by poets and playwrights back then that could be very, very offensive. And I talk a little bit about Midsummer Night's Dream, which we've had conversations about on the podcast, Stephen, as a political satire that really is an embarrassment for the Queen Elizabeth and to the Duke of Alençon. But a decade after their romance is over, perhaps Shakespeare, whoever he was, got away with it. His poetic license, unlike Johnson's or Chapman's or others who were placed in prison for the words they wrote. He never was called forth before the Star Chamber or imprisoned or tortured or any of those things that some of the other playwrights had to suffer.
And some of them, and back to another episode we've had with Bonner Miller Cutting about what some of the different writers have suffered in their time for the things that they wrote. And, don't forget that the means of torture at that time were pretty extreme.
Yes.
You want to talk about violence, with things like putting the screws to people and where those cliches come from. Banding was a horrific form of torture where they would literally use like steel straps and tighten them down on somebody crouched in a fetal position until their bones started to break.
Yeah.
They did that to Thomas Nash and ended up killing him later on because of the injuries he suffered. I believe
he died within a year of the interrogation, of course, after the investigation of Marlowe, who, the great reckoning in a small room where he was stabbed in the eye by one of the court-sponsored spies, a group of them. So, yeah, it was a very hazardous occupation to be a writer during that time. Very hazardous.
Let's recap the lineup because I want to make sure we didn't miss anybody. Did we miss anybody? Did we get them all?
I'm pretty sure we have all the presenters who are going to be presenting actual papers. Of course, you'll have John Hamill on hand, the president of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, to add further commentaries with you. You being the MC, and John and Ben August being our hosts, who will also assist in some regards. But I think we've actually mentioned the 10 or so presenters that will be actively presenting papers during this time.
And Ben has promised, and I'll use this as a teaser as well, the next episode of this program, which will be released just 2 days before the symposium, will feature Ben August and a discussion about a piece of Shakespeare memorabilia that he actually owns. Yes. And he has promised that we will be able to demonstrate and reveal that piece live in the symposium and show everybody at the viewing audience exactly what it looks like and how beautiful it is. And I'll leave it at that. You'll have to tune in to the next episode to hear about that in my discussion with Ben. And then you'll have to tune into the symposium to see the revealing of it as well. But he has promised that we'll be able to use that live on the broadcast.
Well, I'm very excited. This goes back to a very ancient text, I understand. So I won't spoil the broth here by spilling the beans. But I want to just talk a little bit very briefly about the actual word symposium. It's a gathering of scholars who take a particular topic and give presentations, which is exactly what we are doing. But the actual word symposium comes in some directly way from Plato, from Plato's dialogue, the Symposium, which was composed sometime between 380 and 375 BCE. In this dinner party, all-nighter, drinking and dinner party, great entertainment, to celebrate the victory of the tragic playwright Agathon in the Trilogies competition during the Dionysia. This symposium is being described by one of the guests by the name of Aristodemus, who was Socrates' personal guest, related 30 years after the event. So it's written. It was Agathon's triumph was 30 years prior to the actual writing of the story. So it's a very fictionalized narrative, and it's actually a rather dramatic. It's the most dramatic of all the dialogues because there's multiple contributors. Alcibiades, the famous Greek general, is there besides Socrates. Agathon, Aristophanes, the great old comedy tragic poet. Phaedrus is there, and the whole theme is talking about the manifestations of love, of eros, the descriptions of eros. And it is near the end of the series of presentations and speeches about it, including commentaries on the virtue of Queen Alcestis by Phaedrus, talks about the ability of love to cause human beings to sacrifice themselves for each other. And of course, the Alcestis story is from Euripides' tragic comedy, the Alcestis, which is used by Shakespeare as for the inspiration for his final scenes in both The Winter's Tale and Much Ado About Nothing. So he may have learned, the Earl of Oxford, when at the age of 19, he purchased his Plato in folio, so a collection of Plato's dialogues in folio at the age of 19, would have been immediately fascinated by the symposium because it featured playwrights and poets and philosophers and military people, and the topic was love. And in the very final lines of this dialogue, Socrates, in the early dawn morning, while everybody else is passing out, is lecturing Aristophanes and Agathon, the comic and tragic playwrights, that a true genius could write both tragedies and comedies. I was shocked when I read that line, and I said, "Of course, the Earl of Oxford would have been totally inspired by this story." And in fact, the Aristophanes, The Clouds, mocked Socrates, which was written, of course, about 20 years before this play, this dialogue was written. And in some regards, scholars are claiming that Plato's writing the symposium is a direct response and rebuttal of Aristophanes mocking his philosopher friend Socrates in the play. Ironically, it was The Clouds that was cited in the trial of Socrates in 399 BC. That resulted in his conviction and having the
famous hemlock drink,
the famous hemlock cup. Yes,
famous hemlock concoction.
Yes, I would recommend a book called The Hemlock Cup, which is about that whole period of Socrates' life and what Athens was like during that time.
But see, even there, and that kind of ties into what we were just talking about just a moment ago about how dangerous it has always been to be a writer in times of history. And there's another prime example.
Yes.
And not the only, like you also mentioned the banishment of Ovid, for instance.
Yes.
There are others who in the ancient Greeks who were banished as well. The Socrates, of course, being the most famous because they actually put him to death. But there were others that were banished and not sentenced to death, but were exiled from society because of the subversive nature of what they had written or how critical it was of those in power at the time.
The poet playwright Phrynicus was fined basically a year's salary for insulting families whose ancestors had perished during the Battle of Marathon. So you had to be very, very, very clever about writing political material if you were writing tragedies. Now, the comedies that Aristophanes wrote are blatantly political, even naming characters, leaders in Athens, besides Socrates, of course, but Cleon was his main target, who was a tyrant that kind of took over Athens after the Pericles' death during the Peloponnesian War. But Cleon sued Aristophanes unsuccessfully for having been insulted on the stage. So there was this brief window in the Greek era during the Golden Age in which the comic poets, playwrights, could write very political satires. They're very topical. And Aristophanes, of course, his works are well understood to have gone in that direction. But even Sophocles in Oedipus Tyrannos, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the King, the story of Oedipus and who ends in blinding himself and all, was provoked in some regard by the plague in Athens in 499 BCE at the start of what became the Peloponnesian War. And it was Pericles who was being criticized for having caused the plague by Sophocles allegorically. because it was the plague in Thebes that set the stage for the problems that would ensue, and in Oedipus' exploration of who it was that had killed his father. So Sophocles could get away with it. He was a general, an archon, highly respected citizen, but he had to write allegorically if he wanted to be at all politically critical. But following the defeat of Athens by Sparta, at the end of that, the oligarchy was installed, and that was the end of all openly political playwriting at that time. So we had that brief window 2,500 years ago and until Shakespeare. And then Shakespeare, you have similar capacities for writing material that's quite critical, quite satirical, quite provocative, that has a direct political message.
But he could get away with a Midsummer Night's Dream and a Richard II,
Yes,
all in the same lifetime. So he transcended the ancient Greeks in that sense, because he did the political satire on both spectrums and political criticism on both spectrums, and did it, both of them quite well.
Very much so.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to be a fascinating symposium, and I love the history of the word there, and the etymology, as it were.
I would recommend the listeners wiki, the Plato Symposium, and read a little bit about that wonderful piece of work that I'm sure inspired the poet playwright, whoever he was, that wrote the works of Shakespeare. We have our candidate.
And if you look at our symposium and the lineup we've just discussed, we don't have any generals involved in ours, but we do have some poets, playwrights, actors, scholars, professors, lawyers, all involved. And so it is quite an eclectic collection. So I think it fits Plato's description of a symposium quite well.
I think it absolutely does fit the description quite well. And it is that we love the works of Shakespeare. And it's various expressions that we're contributing to that aspect of love that is foundational to the whole idea of the symposium itself. It has to do with the generous passions that are aroused by our experience of theater that drive us in this direction. And so you will be, I'm sure, entertained royally. And in between all these talks will be the video contest finalists. And I think your listeners will very much enjoy seeing these things. Now, of course, Stephen, many of these presentations will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship YouTube channel, in the months ahead after the symposium is over. So if you happen to be preoccupied on October 2nd and 3rd and unable to participate in the live stream productions, there will be recorded sessions that you'll be able to pick up on the YouTube channel later in the fall and through the course of the year.
That's correct. We will be reposting them in the future so that they will be available in case you're not able to view them while they're happening on October 2nd and 3rd, or if for some reason you're not able to commit to the entire symposium schedule. Now, to talk about the symposium schedule, here's what it is. It will be Friday, October 2nd, 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So that's 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And then the following morning, Saturday morning, we will resume at 9 a.m. Pacific Time and go to 5 p.m. Pacific Time. So that's noon to 8 p.m. Eastern Time, depending upon where you're at and where you're listening to this program from right now. I know right now many of you are probably listening to it from the shower or your car or maybe your morning jog. But whatever time zone you happen to be in, when you're ready to tune into the symposium, those will be the hours of the symposium. It will be a full 10 hours of presentation. So 2 hours that Friday evening and then a full 8 hours on Saturday the 3rd. And we hope you can join us for all of it. Remember, it is absolutely free to participate and to register. If you register, you get backup materials, support materials, the syllabus, as Earl mentioned, some reading lists and other resources that will help enrich your experience. And you'll get all of that ahead of time. So you'll actually also be able to do your own pre-research if you want, familiarize yourself with some of the topics, some of the presenters, and really be ready to dive in with us as we continue to explore the Shakespeare authorship question for our Shakespeare Authorship Symposium.
You want to add one more thing here, Stephen. This is the very first time we've done this kind of symposium online. We did actually a symposium that was a 4-hour event in the spring from the National Press Club, which was wonderful. All the talks that were given on that occasion, including Tom Renier's talk, are available on our YouTube channel. So this will be actually the second symposium that we're doing, but we don't know what we're going to be doing through the course of the next year. We do hope that we can bring everybody who's listening and who is interested in coming to our next conference to Ashland next September 30th through October 3rd, 2021. But at this point, we are not certain that the Oregon Shakespeare Festival will have plays in production during that time. So the location of our conference for next year was still somewhat up in the air. And if it turns out that travel and public health concerns was still mitigated against having a live conference next fall, we certainly would want to continue to produce symposia in the future of this nature so that we can keep your listeners and our readers up to date on the latest research and ideas, thinking, and discourse that concerns the Shakespeare attribution. There's 3 or 4 of our speakers have produced books within the last few years, so we're really cutting edge in this regard, and we want to continue to be so. So I would encourage those of you who really enjoy these programs to consider making a donation so that and specify that this is for a future symposia, and that we will continue to work on your behalf in terms of spreading information and knowledge about Shakespeare and the authorship question into the future.
Well, I know there are 2 other things that are on our target list once the symposium is completed and as we move forward through the rest of 2020 and into early 2021. One is that some of our presenters have talked about offering future presentations, whether that be through a Zoom platform or a GoToMeeting platform or whatever the platform is, but something similar to that, where people can register for those and participate directly live with the presenter on various topics. And I know that members of our Speakers Bureau who are tech savvy and Zoom savvy have also talked about making themselves available to groups of people who may want a presentation on the Shakespeare authorship question for their organization. Now, think about that. If you're a listener and you're wondering, well, what does that exactly mean? Well, if you're a member of an organization or a club or a group or a book group or any sort of Zoom group, and you're looking for material, you're looking for presentations or presenters, maybe it's a Rotary Club or a Kiwanis Club or something like that, give us a call, contact us, and we will line up a presenter for you to establish a Zoom meeting for you and the members of your organization to tune into to receive a presentation from one of the members of our Speakers Bureau. And that goes for educators as well. There's a lot of educators out there right now trying to reinvent education through digital platforms, and maybe they don't have as much material as they would like to have, or they're looking for curriculum ideas. We have such a wonderful group of presenters that can present on Shakespeare and so many other topics, whether it's Shakespeare in the law, Shakespeare in medicine, Shakespeare in botany, Shakespeare in politics, Shakespeare in history, Shakespeare and theatrics. I mean, the list goes Shakespeare and the stars, Shakespeare in biology. Like they're all there. The Shakespeare was an expert on just about everything. And, I myself have taught a class called The Science of Shakespeare, and it covers 10 different fields of science that you can find within the Shakespearean canon and develop. And that class can be tailored from 3rd grade through 12th grade. And we have plenty of programs like that. So if there are educators listening and they would like to enrich their curriculum and maybe have someone else take over the Zoom for 30 to 45 minutes for them during the school day, reach out to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. You can go to ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, go to our Speakers Bureau page. The email contact information is right there. Shoot us an email. We'll get back to you and we'll be able to put something together for you. It's that simple. So it's available. We're your source and resource for all things Shakespeare authorship question. Tap into that if you need to.
You are such a clever devil, Stephen. I think this is a great suggestion. And I know that I'm going to be speaking to several groups in the next couple of months. in a similar Zoom platform. So yes, do take the advantage of contacting the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship if you're interested in having a specific topic covered. And we will look forward to finding you a speaker who's willing to set up and provide that kind of content for you. I mean, we are native-born lovers of theater from a variety of perspectives, and we have a lot of content available through the core of presenters and writers that we have within our community, and we would love to share this with you. Typically at our conferences, we entertain anywhere from 100 to 150 people attending. We've already gotten up to 150 people registered for the conference, for the symposium, Steven. So we're going to be reaching out to a larger audience yet, and we encourage you to contact your friends and have them register for the symposium if they are at all curious about Shakespeare and the authorship question. I think they will be delighted to learn what they can learn from our variety of presenters.
Well, and look at the beauty. So, yes, it is unfortunate that we were not able to have our live conference this fall that was planned to be held in Ashland, Oregon. But we were able to put together this symposium. And because we are not bound by the constraints of a banquet room or a hotel or a location, a physical location, we can open this symposium up to far more people than we would have been able to open a conference to, and to be able to offer it through our generous donors, to offer it free to the viewers who want to tune in. And that in itself is an exciting aspect to it. We do hope that we will be able to have our conference for fall 2021. And I know that has been rescheduled for Ashland, Oregon. We're hoping that will all go as planned, and we will be through all of this that we're going through now and be able to meet and gather again together in person. But also the already successful registration of this online symposium bespeaks that this is something that we should maybe consider doing again for a wider audience, because of the fact that there are people who maybe cannot travel or who cannot fit in the space big enough. If we end up with what we can end up with. I don't know what the max amount of conference attendees we will be able to facilitate in Ashland. But I'm sure it's somewhere caps around 200.
Well, depending on social distancing parameters.
Let's say prior to the social distancing, when we were planning the conference for this fall in Ashland,
we had purchased 150 tickets to Midsummer Night's Dream and to Tempest each. So we were prepared to serve that many people, and we probably could have done more. And I would hope that eventually we can double that number. We could in Ashland. We actually have room to do that in the conference facilities. The Ashland Hills Inn and Suites is a lovely place, and I'm so looking forward to someday, perhaps next year, if not the year after, certainly, to be able to welcome all of you in person, because I think you would enjoy very much meeting Steven and other members of our Oxfordian community, and feeling like you're really part of a larger movement that has historical consequences that will reach far beyond our small contributions here today.
In the meantime, be sure to get registered for the symposium. Remember, again, it's October 2nd and 3rd, coming to you live from Napa, California. Free to register, free to view and attend. And to kind of piggyback on Earl's description of symposium and his description of all of us as Shakespeare lovers, I guess we really are fulfilling what Plato had to say, because it will be Eros that drives us. And it will be that love that has made us sacrifice ourselves in any way that we can to continue to send this message. And as always, we want to remind you, please go back, and there are more than 40 episodes of this podcast now. In fact, I believe this one right here that you're listening to will be episode number 44 or 45 in the series. So if you haven't gone back and you haven't listened to the other 40 plus, you need to do that. You'll find some great favorites there, I'm certain. And if you would, wherever you're streaming us from, whether that be Apple, iTunes, or Spotify, or whatever your streaming source of choice is, if there is a rate and review option, please do that. Please give us a rating. Please give us a review. We're very proud right now to have a 4.6 out of 5 on on Apple iTunes. And so we like to keep that going, and some lovely, wonderful reviews posted there as well. And we sure would love you to add yours. So if you'd go in and do that for us, we'd appreciate that. Don't forget to visit dragonwagonradio.com. dragonwagonradio.com. You'll find a bunch of other very interesting and wonderful podcasts on the network that we're just a part of. And you'll also find the swag shop. You can go get your Don't Quill the Messenger t-shirt, coffee mug, and other wonderful merchandise. I love to sport mine, and it's always a great topic of conversation wherever I go, whenever I wear my Quiller t-shirt. So fellow Quillers, go out and get your Quiller swag on. We'd appreciate that. And your contributions do help fund the program. So if you buy something at the swag shop, some of those proceeds do help fund the program and go to keeping the podcast alive. So we appreciate that as well. Thank you, as always, for joining us from wherever you are. We appreciate your listenership. I know I specifically certainly do. And I always want to remind you, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.